Hello and welcome to another episode of National Divorce Talk Raw, where we make sure that you get the information on the topic of national peaceful divorce or any type of separation in America, other separation movements around the world, and what the CalExit movement is doing. This is the official channel for the real CalExit movement. Other people may attempt to claim the title, but they do not. My name is Marcus Ruiz Evans. I started the movement in 2012. I recently broke from a organization that I had been tied to for a while, and I have started to work with a recollection of the original members, and we've done our best to get the word out there. Hope that you have a chance to go check us out at our new home. Let me show that to you real quick. So this is the I Love You California CalExit home. So this is the official home of the CalExit movement for California independence. It was created under the elected leader from the CalExit Congress who voted on a vice president, president, and CEO recently. I became the president's spokesperson. Rabbi Stephen Axelman became the vice president, and Jason Wright became the CEO of the CalExit movement with holding democratic elections. Here's the new site. This is the one to go check out. Other sites may purport to represent us, but they do not. You have to be very careful. There's a lot of lying going on right now. So if you want to see that, check out that site. The other thing is that, of course, you can always find me at my YouTube site. YouTube channel is literally called Marcus Ruiz Evans. There's a picture of me. It says CalExit. And then you can watch all of the National Divorce Talk Raw videos or Sweaty Mexican Chronicles if you want to have a laugh. A lot of politics and then a couple of yucks to get it in there. But let's get right into it. So we're going to cover federal failures for California. One of the things that we like to cover that the news will not is routinely the times when the federal government fails California. Now, when Donald Trump was president, the news did a great job of pointing out all of the federal failures because they were able to blame it on Trump. We agreed with that. The only difference that we had with the media was that we said the federal failures began much before Trump and still continued after Trump. One of our favorite talking points was after Biden was elected. His policy on immigrants and Mexican kids at the border was identical to Donald Trump's. Minorities and immigrants with brown skin are not allowed in, and it's okay to keep them in concentration camp conditions. That has continued under the reign of Vice President Kamala Harris, President Joseph Biden, and it is a mirror of the policies under Donald Trump. So we have said routinely that the federal government has failed Californians and will continue to fail Californians. You only saw it in a spectacular fashion with Donald Trump, but it didn't stop there. After Donald Trump left, Biden continued the kids in cages policy. Biden continued the horrible immigration policy, and Biden hired an ex-Chevron executive to lead climate change for him. So give me 1 second to figure out where that is. Sorry, the video is playing. I don't know why. So we're going to cover federal failures for California. I'm going to show you some of the recent federal failures, and then I will prove to you that this is just a few in a long line. So let's get right to it. So the first one coming up is old data. CDC apparently misjudged California's COVID risk. This came out recently in Cal Matters, a well-known policy journal. The CDC said half of Californians live in high-risk counties, but the agency apparently relied on outdated numbers of COVID infections and patients. Newer data indicates that only 19 out of the California's 52 counties are in the CDC's riskiest category, where universal masking is advised. Federal officials who reported that nearly half of Californians live in high-risk counties for COVID-19 were relying on old data, and only a small number of counties fall into that category. At stake is whether counties considered high risk should keep indoor masking requirements under new guidance from the U.S. Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, or follow the state's lead in removing nearly all masking requirements. Now, what's interesting about that is you would recall that California has routinely ignored CDC advice and done its own thing. This was very popular under Trump, and many Californians welcomed it. Governor Newsom went on TV and said, we're a nation state and we're not going to follow what the federal government does. And then he formed a coalition with Oregon and Washington to develop their own protocols for reopening the economy. But when Joseph Biden took over, that didn't actually stop it. California disagreed with federal guidance on masking for children and disagreed with the CDC, at least on another measure. So this is the third in a series of measures from the California government saying we're going to ignore federal guidance on how to deal with this pandemic, or the worst emergency that Californians have seen in a century. They did it under Trump. They continue to ignore federal guidance under Biden. And now we're seeing that again. So here's why they're not going to follow CDC guidance, because the CDC was advising Californians poorly. They were inept at their job and using old data. So the point there is that the federal government can't help us in an emergency. Obviously, they didn't do much for us when Trump was around, but now that Biden's here, they're still doing a poor job at assessing risk for us, and we have to do our own thing independent of them. Biden's not Trump, but here you go. We have to act the same to the federal government when it comes to healthcare and CDC laws. I'm going to see if I can try to find that reference on California follows own guidance on masks. I should have prepped for that. California ignores federal guidance on COVID. Well, I'll have to find it. But it happened. I'll have to find the reference. Sorry about that. Anyways, California did ignore federal guidance on COVID with Trump, and then we ignored CDC guidance on masking and related to children when Biden was here. And now we're learning the CDC still, a year to 2 years after COVID, can't do a good job of estimating the risk for Californians. And California, again, this week had to ignore federal guidance on the CDC for this major pandemic. All right, let's go to another one. So this is wildfire survivors say FEMA did little to help those who lost homes. This is in the Los Angeles Times. Let's take a look. The second came when she learned there would be no assistance from the federal government to help her or other survivors of last year's Caldor fire rebuild. So California's been hit with massive forest fires over the last couple of years. People have known about this at least going back to W. Bush. Arnold Schwarzenegger was governor during the time where W. Bush was president of America. He told them that we need helicopters and support for forest fires. W. Bush instead sent all of the assistance and California's National Guard to fight the war in Iraq, which was illegal and completely unnecessary, allowing California's forests to burn down. That was W. Bush and Schwarzenegger. Then you go to Obama and they know about it. Then you go to Trump and they know about it. Then you go to Biden and they know about it. So that's 4 presidential administrations that they've known that wildfires are a major problem. And here we are again. People get burned out and there's no help for them from the federal government, even when they've lost their home and they absolutely deserve it. It's heartbreaking and devastating. I feel like our community has been forgotten about and left behind to pick up the pieces. While the Federal Emergency Management Agency is often seen providing trailers and money to victims of hurricanes, tornadoes, and floods, survivors of this California wildfire complain that their agency has had little to offer to them when their homes were destroyed by flames. So you have a tornado in the Midwest, federal government's going to be there to make you whole. Hurricanes, they'll be there in Florida to help you out. Flooding in the South, they'll be there to help you out. California with wildfires, you get nothing. That's what they're saying. You can go ahead and explain why. If you live in the Midwest or the South or Florida and there's an emergency, you get taken care of. And yet in California, we've never been taken care of for forest fires. And up to this date, with Joe Biden in term, we still are not taken care of for our emergencies while other states are. This is the quality care the federal government provides for us. Let's take another look. Even more worse for more bad news for California regarding COVID. So, millions of Californians at risk of losing health coverage when federal COVID programs end. Expiration of 2 COVID-19 emergency programs means Californians could lose their medical insurance or find covered California unaffordable. 2 to 3 million Californians could lose their Medi-Cal coverage, some as soon this summer, after the federal government's COVID-19 public health emergency ends, now scheduled for next month. So the emergency declaration by the federal government, which is giving people money to deal with the healthcare costs related to COVID, ends next month. Joe Biden has said nothing, done absolutely nothing to let Californians know, don't worry. Even though we're just coming out of COVID, conceivably, the federal government will be there to ensure you and make sure that you get the money you need in this crisis. So here we are. Here's COVID. Federal government can't manage the COVID risk for us. Federal government can't make sure there's money for us to get out of this. Federal government can't provide homes for people during a disaster. See a pattern? An estimated 2 to 3 million Californians could lose Medi-Cal coverage because they now earn too much to qualify or they fail to provide information needed to stay on the program, health advocates explained. So the federal government's going to totally fail us. Let's keep going. We'll get back to that one in a second. Oh, here's another one. This relates to the emergency of COVID, and we already saw how the federal government is failing to handle COVID, but here you go. Why millions of Californians didn't receive their stimulus check. More than 2 million Californians don't earn enough to need to file taxes, but without those filings, the IRS can't reach them. So this came out last year, but I think it's still relevant. 2 weeks ago, a contingent of United Way staffers descended on a tiny Tule Lake 3 miles south of Oregon border in Siskiyou County, where they were trying to scan people so they could give them the stimulus payments. There are 8.8 million Californians receiving state benefits who are eligible for stimulus checks, according to a study by the California Policy Lab, and 2 million of them don't earn enough needed to file taxes. But without those filings, the IRS can't reach them. So the point is that here we are. Here's an emergency. Big emergency in COVID, they can't get the money to all the Californians who need it. Big emergency in COVID, they can't get the money to Californians who need it. Big emergency in COVID, they can't get the numbers right to get the risk estimate right for Californians. Also, if there's an emergency, don't expect help from the federal government, especially if you lost everything that you own. All right, moving on. The Supreme Court is the highest court in America. Whatever it says is the law, unless Congress writes an amendment or a law superseding that. Recently, UC Berkeley lost the fight over rights to patent valuable gene editing technology. This came out very recently. A federal patent board says the valuable rights to develop and market gene editing, the transfer of genetic technology between living organisms, and the potential to cure disease belongs not to UC Berkeley, but to a research institute affiliated with Harvard and the Massachusetts Institute of Technologies. A researcher with the Broad Institute published a study in 2012 describing how the so-called CRISPR technology could be used to alter genes in other humans, animals, and plants. Said it was challenged by the University of California, which contended the work was not original. 6 months before Broad's team, a team of scientists by UC Berkeley biochemist Jennifer Doudna had issued the first report on the use of CRISPR to alter DNA. On Monday, however, the U.S. Patent Trial and Appeals Board said Broad's research had been original and its patent valid. Although Berkeley was the first to uncover technology that could transform genetic material, the board said it involved DNA bacteria and had no direct application to genes in animals whose cells are classified as eukaryotes. Doudna, the UC Berkeley researcher, won the Nobel Prize in Chemistry for the groundbreaking research on CRISPR. So here's what's going on. UC Berkeley does original research on gene editing. It's so awesome, they win the Nobel Prize. And then the federal government says, no, these universities that are really close to Washington, D.C., actually, they should have the right to it. The point of universities is to publish original research. And so, although California universities published original research, which means they should get all the recognition, the federal government is kind of going against the whole point of universities and saying, even though you published original research, it wasn't original enough, and we're going to differentiate it enough to make sure that Harvard gets the benefit of this technology and not you, California, even though you did the research first and you did such a good job. You won the Nobel Prize for this. Not good enough for us, federal government. We're going to make sure these other universities not in California get the patent to this valuable technology and not UC Berkeley. That's clearly preference. It reminds me of the time with the Enron scandal, where the federal government told Enron in back channels that it was okay to price gouge California so that Texas could make a lot of money. And when California complained, George W. Bush and the federal government stalled any investigation for 2 to 3 years until it was too late. And then it went to federal courts, and California got back, I think, a third or tenth of the amount of money they lost in price gouging from Enron, which was protected by the federal government and the federal courts. So it's not like we haven't seen a preference by the federal government for a state that they like at that time. So Joe Biden's from the East Coast, Delaware, and Pennsylvania. Harvard, MIT are on the East Coast near them. They get the benefit, we get nothing, even though we follow the academic rules that go back hundreds of years. This mirrors what happened with George W. Bush and allowing Enron to price gouge us, blocking any investigation into it for a few years, and then making sure the court system didn't adequately compensate California for our losses. So don't be surprised when there's preferences by the federal government to protect someone other than California and they don't treat us fairly. Let's continue. Oh, this is the UC Berkeley loses patent right article. Okay. Okay, now let's go to this one. The media made me think that San Francisco would be an apocalyptic hellscape, but it was lovely. So this is in the San Francisco Chronicle. Here's a East Coast writer who's never actually been to San Francisco in his entire life. A month ago, he went. And what he's saying in this article is, you know, I watched American news and they said San Francisco was god-awful and horrible and the end of the world. I'd never actually been there. I just watched the news. So I was sure that San Francisco was horrible. When I actually physically went there, it was kind of nice and definitely not as bad as they said. We've talked about how the New York Times and other newspapers routinely talk about how California's over, it's the end of the world, the whole thing's dysfunctional, it's going to die, needles everywhere, feces everywhere, and it's not true. So those articles are not written by people from California. They're written by people not from California who are looking from the outside in and saying, look how horrible you are. This guy's saying he was a New Yorker or an East Coast person. He bought all the American media and assumed that we were so horrible. There was an article by the New York Times where an East Coast person wrote an article about the forest fires in California and concluded California was over. So again, bias from the East Coast against us. We must be backwards and horrible. They don't know us, and so they assume the absolute worst. And don't think it's just in a chamber all by itself. Here's another example of bias by the East Coast, right? The courts are over on the East Coast. The federal system is in D.C., in the East Coast. Harvard's close to that. MIT is close to that. University of California system is as far away from those as you could possibly get outside of the state of California. And there's bias for them against Californians. We also saw this with the FEMA, where they were talking about how FEMA takes care of people in the South and the Midwest and Florida. But when it comes to California, you get nothing. That seems like bias. Our universities do groundbreaking work, but they get nothing because the federal government says we're going to prefer these East Coast universities. That seems like bias. Here's an East Coast reporter saying, I bought the biased reporting of California. It's pretty bad. So I think you've seen that there's a lot of bias. There's a lot of the federal government not coming through. But I really want to sink the point home. So here's what we're going to do. We're going to cover some of these references, some of my favorites. Okay. So this is an old amount of material. Counter arguments: America will not help in a natural or financial disaster. My first one is 1985. In April, Governor Duke Mason of California rejected an offer from the federal government to give the state 1/6 of the fund, or about $233 million. He was saying California deserves about $1.3 billion, has piled up in an escrow account of revenues from California oil. Federal officials reportedly want to use as much of that as possible to reduce the deficit. So remember, California is a donor state. And here's our governor saying, hey, you have $1.3 billion from oil off of California. We're a donor state. We'd like some of that. And the federal government says, nah, you can get 1/6 of what you actually deserve. Yeah, we know you're a donor state. Yeah, we know you pay more into the system than you get. And yeah, we know you made an extra 1.3 billion, but we're going to keep that and you really don't get anything. 1985, 6 months in, on the 16th, LA Times, Governor Duke Mason. Then let's go to 1989, the Loma Prieta earthquake. California had to wait for 2 years, and in certain cases, 4 years in order to get the money to rebuild, and the building is not open. The federal government wants to fix cracks in the wall. California wanted to fix the buildings so they did not crumble in the next earthquake. Hundreds of millions of dollars are held up. So Loma Prieta had a massive earthquake. The federal government made us wait 2 years, and then they just wanted to do surface fixtures, where here in California, we actually live with earthquakes. And we're saying if you're going to repair that building, you have to make it earthquake safe. The federal government didn't want to do it. They wanted to do some slap-on job to get going again, whereas we're saying if you're going to repair the building, you have to make it earthquake safe. They didn't want to do that. That's the Loma Prieta earthquake in 1989. Governor Duke Mason endorsed a temporary quarter-cent tax after the Loma Prieta earthquake damaged the San Francisco Bay Area in 1989, the special levy, which raised $761 million. So here's the Loma Prieta earthquake. We had to wait 2 to 4 years to get the money we needed. They didn't want to do anything but fix cracks in the wall. So we had to raise taxes of $761 million in 1994 on ourselves in order to pay. All the same while, we're a donor state. So if an earthquake happens, you're not going to get the money on time. You're not going to get what you need to actually be safe. And then you're going to have to tax yourself again. This is in 1994, 1989, 3 decades ago. It keeps going. Let's go to 1992, financial assistance. In 1992, during the recession, California voted for President Clinton at the time and had people in political parties in the state and the president's same party. California was the most hurt state in the nation for this recession, and California received no help from the federal government. As Clinton goes, so goes the state economy. Recession-weary California stands to benefit if the president-elect can deliver on his campaign promises. State to feel full effect of changes. Economy. Clinton's proposed tax and spending plans are likely to hurt Californians more than other Americans. The California economy. So the point is that we had a recession in 1992. We were a donor state. We went to President Clinton and said, hey, there's a massive recession, an emergency. We're a donor state. We've paid a lot to you. Can you help us out? And in 1992, Clinton said, no, I'm not going to do that. I'm not going to help you out with this recession. In fact, my plan to deal with the recession is to come up with fiscal policies that will make it even worse on California. And that was after California voted for him. That's what you get in 1992. Let's take a look at the Northridge earthquake in 1994. Let me see if I can activate this article. Well, maybe not. Let's stop that. We'll go back to this. So in 1994, with the Northridge earthquake, what happened was the FEMA did a horrible job of taking care of disabled people in California. So again, another earthquake. It happens. Remember this one, Loma Prieta. We didn't get the money we needed. We had to tax ourselves. Here's the federal government just a few years later. Here's another earthquake. And they can't actually take care of disabled Californians. That's why it made that article. Here's a little bit more on Clinton administration officials are angry that Governor Pete Wilson has been complaining for more than a year about the federal government is doing too little to assist California in relation to this earthquake here. All right, let's go to another one. 1994. When floodwaters engulfed the Midwest, when hurricanes swamped the East Coast, Californians were willing to help. Governor Wilson of California said Thursday in a televised address to Angelenos. Now Californians need the nation's help. Wilson has also blamed federal defense cuts for the state's economic woes and has criticized U.S. environmental officials for trying to restrict water to use to protect fish. Republican Assemblywoman Paula Boland, whose Northridge-based district was hammered in the quake, says the federal government has shorted California and other areas and should be pressed to provide maximum aid in this instance. Boland said the state's economy is in far worse shape than it was in 1989 and would not be able to withstand another tax increase. So, had the Northridge earthquake, not getting the amount of money you need to deal with that emergency. Same thing that happened with the Loma Prieta earthquake. See a pattern? Then here's the Northridge earthquake, and you don't get it. Let's go here to my favorite, the 2000 electricity massacre. So basically, this is all about Enron. The federal government allowed Enron to price gouge California. 4 years later, a federal investigation judged that Enron and other Houston, Texas-based energy companies illegally price gouged California economy, causing the budget surplus to turn to a deficit within 1 year. So California actually had a budget surplus, and we were price gouged so hard by energy companies, including Enron in Texas, that were protected by the federal government. We lost the entire surplus and went into a deficit that year. It took 3 years for the federal government to be able to look into the case, at which time California kept having hemorrhaging cash to Texas for price gouging. Then it finally comes out, oh, they were price gouged. In the end, only Enron and not the other companies who price gouged California had to pay. Of the money that Enron stole for California through illegal means, it was only required to pay about 1/10 of the amount taken. Of that amount, California is only expected to see 1/6 or around 3% of the total amount taken from the California economy. So Bush allowed Enron to price gouge us. They got the federal government to stall any investigation into it. When it finally went to the federal courts 4 years later, we got 3% of the amount of money that we lost. That's bias from the federal government to price gouge us. And I was living here during that time. We had blackouts. Power just went out. You didn't have power. You got to live in the dark, like the medieval ages. That was because the federal government allowed Texas to do that. Texas was not thoroughly punished. The energy companies were not punished. We never got back 97% of the money that we lost. Nor was there any federal assistance during that time to help with the energy crisis. Let's take another look at the dot-com bubble of 2000 and the housing crisis in 2008. During the decade from 1995 to 2005, then Federal Reserve Alan Greenspan overreacted to several shocks to the economy. When a financial turbulence hit in 1997 and 1998, the Asian crisis, the Russian ruble collapse, and the failure of long-term capital management, the Fed increased liquidity and accidentally helped set off the dot-com bubble. So the money supply in California is seen by the Federal Reserve. They print the money, they run the money. We were having a massive housing inflation crisis, seem familiar. And what the federal government did was increase liquidity so that this bubble that California was beginning to go into, it would automatically go into. So we're having the dot-com bubble, we're having a housing crisis, and the best thing would be to reduce the ability of how easy it would be to get a loan so that you could cool down the price increases in the economy in California. Instead, the head of the Federal Reserve says, no, let's do the total opposite of what California could benefit from. Let's increase liquidity and set off the bubble even more in California, which burst and caused the 2001 recession in California, which California was the worst hit in all of America. Here's the article to prove it. Then we go to 2002, 2007 for the terrorist attack. California did not receive federal financial assistance to guard against the 9/11 attack, although it ranked most likely to have a terrorist attack by the federal government. California was the most vulnerable place in all of the USA for a terrorist attack because of its many seaports, airports, and international borders. Michael Chertoff, head of Homeland Security at the time, said that. California did not receive adequate security funding, despite the fact that it was most in need from the federal government for 10 years. Despite repeated attempts to have this issue addressed, it still has been ignored by the federal government. And I'm not exaggerating. Here's all the articles. Here's Dianne Feinstein and other people saying, hey, Homeland Security, you said California is the most vulnerable to terrorist attack. Just had the worst terrorist attack in America ever. Maybe we could get some of that money. Nah, you can wait 5 years to get anything. And in half a decade, maybe a terrorist brings a nuclear bomb through the border or through the ports, whatever, and you all die. It's cool. No sweat. So they're saying we got to deal with terrorism. Here's the most vulnerable spot to terrorism. You get nothing for 5 years. That's another emergency where they just didn't come through. And my favorite, 2006, it is revealed that FEMA has no plans for what to do with an earthquake in California, even though the Earthridge earthquake was 12 years later. The letter came in response to a post-Katrina criticism from Boxer, that's Senator Boxer, California, that FEMA is unprepared for a California disaster, despite having once identified a San Francisco quake as one of the most likely catastrophes facing the country. There's nothing in this letter that gives Senator Boxer any comfort that a catastrophic earthquake in California would be handled any better than Katrina. While Senator Boxer and Senator Dianne Feinstein have called for a congressional inquiry into the lack of federal disaster recovery plans for California, federal officials maintain that local and state agencies are responsible for such emergencies. So, 2006, the federal agency in charge of handling disasters says, we have no plans on what to do for an earthquake. The most likely disaster in California, an earthquake. The most likely big disaster to happen in America, an earthquake in San Francisco, but they have no plans how to deal with that, even though they had to deal with earthquakes previously. And in fact, when pressed, federal officials said, you know, it's not really our job as FEMA to deal with emergencies. It's your job in California to handle it. That's a lie. So they can't handle earthquakes. And when pressed, they go, that's not our job to help you out in an emergency. You do it on your own. And here we go. 2008, California overwhelmed by forest fires. We asked for federal assistance. California got no federal assistance from the federal government. The forest burned down. We had to rent helicopters and staff from other states and use California tax money to pay for the fire because our California National Guard was shipped out to Iraq, which was illegal and unnecessary. Here's all the articles. So, you know, you got an earthquake, we get nothing 3 times in a row. They say they don't even consider it our issue. Forest fires, we're allowed to burn down all the time. Going back to 2008, we're allowed to have these forest fires burned down. Then this year we saw that even if you lose your home in a forest fire, the federal government's saying we have nothing for you. Here's another one. So remember when California asked Bill Clinton for financial assistance during that recession, 1992. Now we can fast forward to 2009, the global recession. California needs money to help get out of the recession. Governor Schwarzenegger goes to President Obama, another Democrat, very popular in California, and says, California is the worst hit in this recession. We need help. We're a donor state. Can you help us out? And Obama says, no, you're going to get nothing. There's all the articles. So that's the second recession with a Democrat in charge where we said, we're a donor state. Can you give us a little bit of money to help buttress against the recession? And we get absolutely nothing. So when it comes to earthquakes, we don't get help. And in fact, FEMA has said, we don't have any plans on it to help you, and it's your fault, and you should do it all on your own. And then when it comes to recessions, we had 2 different Democratic presidents say, no, you're on your own, you get nothing. And then 2016, forest fires destroy entire community in California. Federal government denies assistance for 283 families left homeless. FEMA denies assistance to Erskine fire victims, 2016. FEMA denies assistance to fire victims, 2022. See a pattern? So you get in a fire, you're on your own. CDC data, not good, can't really trust it. Help with CDC, can't really handle that. San Francisco sucks. Let's just buy all the bias. Oh, did you need a stimulus check? We're probably not going to be able to get it out to a couple million Californians. We're going to have a bias for Harvard over these other places. And when it really comes down to it, if you are dealing with a earthquake, you are screwed. If you're dealing with a recession, you are screwed. This has happened multiple times over the last couple of years. And the federal government, frankly, has bias to other states. In Texas, it let us price gouge us. And now we can see with FEMA that they're more willing to help people in the Midwest than here in California. Again, I don't know why the government or the news doesn't cover this. Oh, and also for terrorism. It took 5 years to get our terrorism assistance money to prevent another terrorist attack after the worst terrorist attack. When the Homeland Security said we were the most likely to be hit, they let us just stay vulnerable for half a decade. So the point is this. A lot of people say, you can't leave the federal government because if you do, what happens if there's an emergency? And my talking point is, what are you talking about? Terrorism? Wait 5 years? Earthquakes? You get nothing? That's happened 3 times in a row. Recessions? That's happened twice in a row. You get it? You get nothing. And now we've seen with the CDC, no guidance either. So forest fires, nothing. Recessions, nothing. Pandemics, nothing. Energy crises, nothing. What exactly is the crisis that happens where the federal government comes out and helps California? As I think I've just shown over the last 30 years, going back to 1985 or 1989, they don't help no matter what. So the federal government is a total failure for California and does not help an emergency. And if we seceded from them, we'd lose absolutely nothing at all. There you go.